Judith, you're an expert in philosophical theology with a particular specialty in eschatology, the study of ultimate things. And those ultimate things affect individual consciousness because that's what happens ultimately to a consciousness. And so that's the normal assumption that you make, is that human consciousness exists and all the things that may or may not happen to it in an ultimate future. What I want to try to do is leverage your expertise, but in the reverse arrow of causation.
All right.
And say, let's assume the eschatology that you believe in and you study is real. What would that say then about consciousness? What can we infer from the eschatological ultimate reality? What can we then infer about the nature of consciousness? Is that fair?
I guess so, yes.
Go for it.
Okay, well, it probably sounds a bit wacky because it's such a specifically theological claim. But if we take seriously the Christian eschatological vision of what we call a beatific vision of God, then that runs something like the following. Then that runs something like the following. In the New Testament, there are several passages that seem to suggest that the kind of consciousness that is characteristic of the eschaton, of the final state, whether that of resurrection or an immortal soul after death, Christians are somewhat divided on that, is a vision of God face to face. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, now I see as in a mirror darkly, but then I shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am fully known. And the first letter of John says, beloved, we do not yet know who we are, but we know that when he appears, we will be like him, for we will see him as he is. So there's this sort of claim in the New Testament that our true mode of knowing in the eschatological state will be one of face-to-face vision of God. And the implication is twofold. One, that because we are made in the image of God, we will only know and be ourselves truly when we see God face to face. In other words, the claim here is that the mode of consciousness that is most natural and most basic to us here in this life, namely a sort of self-consciousness, is in a sense a pre-ultimate kind of consciousness which compares to eschatological consciousness in the way that seeing in a mirror darkly compares to seeing face to face.
Okay, but the kind of consciousness that we would have now is not some total transformation. In other words, we'll still have certainly the Abrahamic religions in a resurrection, in all three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You have, you maintain your individual personality. You don't lose that. You may be glorified, you may be incorruptible, whatever. Sounds good, both sound good.
Okay.
But you don't lose that personal touch that you have. You'll still know that I am me.
Yeah.
You won't be absorbed into the
Right.
Great ocean of cosmic consciousness as a drop.
Right. Yes, and that's important. That's characteristic of those Western
And so
religions.
what does that say about our current consciousness, the nature of it?
Well, I think the basic ontological claim underlying the eschatological claim, in Christianity at least, is that the act of creation is an act of love by a triune God, who is always already in himself a triunity of persons related to each other in love. And the creation of the world is out of that love, as an expression of that love, and for the purpose of drawing the creation into that love. And so individuality or personality is not an illusion. It's not any pre-ultimate reality that will disappear. It's something that's already there on a different level, in an analogous sense, in God, and therefore also something that is characteristic of the eschaton, where all people will be drawn into this life of mutual love, which is also a way of knowing. So to know oneself in the eschaton is to see God face to face. but therefore also to be known by God and to be revealed through that face-to-face vision. And I think many modern theologians would add that the continuation of personality means that forever each person is able to have a face-to-face encounter and see God in a way that is individual and personal, which they can then also reflect to everybody else, such that community remains an essential aspect, just as it is in the life of God.
And so to make that a coherent story, theologians talk about between where we are now and in the eschaton, both continuity and discontinuity. Mm-hmm. The discontinuity is obvious, to go from corruptible to incorruptible, mortal to immortal. I mean, that alone is pretty significant discontinuity. But I'm looking for the continuity and how it works.
Sure.
In other words, we agree that there is a continuity in the Abrahamic religions. So is there any sense that we can make a little bit of a progress further to say, well, then how does that happen? It happens through our consciousness, the continuity.
I think so. So I think the earthly, sort of the day-to-day experience, which makes this entire claim of a consciousness that is no longer primarily consciousness of self, but rather a consciousness of self through a face-to-face vision of God, more plausible or less crazy seeming, is the experience that I think we all have, that sometimes we only know ourselves aright by being seen by another person. In other words, that the way I know and experience myself, that I'm conscious of myself, is often much more closed in than to be open to other people in love and to allow them to see and witness us to ourselves. And so I think that this sort of flow of consciousness as not something self-enclosed, but rather something that we owe to each other, is already often a very precious feature of life, which Christians believe will flower in the eschaton.